When I picked up my phone to silence it before heading to my son's 10th anniversary dinner, the screen lit up with a message from my corporate attorney. It simply read, "Call me immediately." I dialed his number with my stiff fingers, expecting a minor tax question. What he told me about my own son completely shattered my reality and forced me into the most ruthless fight of my life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to steal your legacy. I am Henry Mitchell, 71 years old, and until that Tuesday evening, I believed my life's hardest work was firmly behind me. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, wrestling with a silk tie that felt entirely too tight against my throat. The harsh fluorescent light above the sink highlighted every deep line on my face. I wore my charcoal gray suit. It was out of fashion, slightly frayed at the cuffs, but it was the suit I wore when I signed the papers to incorporate Mitchell Logistics 40 years ago. My son Cameron and his wife Vanessa were hosting a lavish dinner at their estate to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary. I was supposed to be the honored patriarch. I adjusted the collar, wincing as a sharp pain shot up my right shoulder. The physical toll of my past labor was a constant companion. My joints ached with the memory of 1,000-pound pallets and freezing loading docks. I reached for my watch on the wooden dresser. Next to the watch sat my smartphone. It began to vibrate intensely, rattling against the polished oak surface. I picked it up, intending to turn off the ringer so I would not interrupt Vanessa's perfectly orchestrated evening. The notification on the screen stopped my breath. It was a text message from Patrick Gallagher. Patrick was not just a lawyer. He was my corporate bulldog, a man who had navigated the legal trenches with me for over 2 decades. Patrick never sent casual text messages. He never texted at all unless the building was literally on fire. The message had 3 words: "Call me immediately." A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The tension spiked instantly, making my already stiff hands feel like blocks of wood. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. I looked at my reflection one last time, completely unaware that the man staring back at me was about to be erased by the person he loved most in the world. Patrick answered on the first ring. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He spoke in a low, rapid voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "Henry, where are you right now?" he demanded. I told him I was in my bedroom, getting ready to drive over to Cameron's house for the anniversary dinner. Patrick took a sharp intake of breath. "You cannot go to that dinner, Henry. You need to come to my office right this second." I frowned, loosening the silk tie I had just struggled to perfectly knot. I asked him what was going on, reminding him that Cameron was expecting me in less than an hour. Patrick's voice dropped an octave, turning deadly serious. "Henry, listen to me very carefully. 2 hours ago, a courier delivered a legal packet to the county clerk's office. My paralegal caught wind of it because she was filing a routine zoning permit for our new fleet yard. The packet was filed by Cameron." I let out a dry laugh, assuming this was some sort of administrative mix-up. I told Patrick that Cameron was just handling the routine tax compliance forms for the end of the quarter, just as I had instructed him to do when I made him acting chief executive officer. Patrick cut me off sharply. "This is not tax compliance, Henry. Cameron just filed a medical power of attorney. He declared you mentally unfit to manage your own affairs." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mentally unfit. I asked Patrick to repeat himself, certain that my hearing aids were malfunctioning. Patrick repeated the words slowly, emphasizing every single syllable. "Cameron submitted a document, signed by a private physician, claiming you are experiencing rapid, severe cognitive decline. He is legally claiming you have dementia, Henry." My knees suddenly felt weak. I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed. The mattress groaned under my weight. My own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man whose Ivy League education I had funded by working 18-hour shifts, was telling the government I was crazy. But the devastating news did not stop there. Patrick continued, his tone turning incredibly urgent. It gets worse, Henry. The power of attorney was just the key to unlock the door. Cameron is actively using this forged document to initiate the sale of the flagship commercial warehouse on the east side. The room started to spin. The flagship warehouse was the beating heart of Mitchell Logistics. It was the absolute foundation of my entire empire. That single property generated the massive passive income that kept the entire company afloat during slow seasons. It was the financial safety net for over 200 employees. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. I asked Patrick who Cameron was selling it to. Patrick revealed the buyer was a ruthless commercial developer we had fought in court 3 years ago. Cameron was selling my legacy to my worst enemy for a quick, massive cash payout. The legal mechanics were terrifyingly brilliant. By declaring me incompetent, Cameron bypassed my majority shareholder voting rights. He was completely liquidating the hardest asset we owned, and he was doing it entirely behind my back. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a mistake. This was a highly calculated, cold-blooded corporate assassination executed by my own flesh and blood. I sat in the silence of my bedroom, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I looked down at my free hand resting on my knee. It was trembling. It had been trembling for 5 years. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, always looked at my shaking hands with barely concealed disgust during family dinners. Cameron had started treating me like a fragile piece of glass, constantly telling me to rest, to step away from the business, to let him handle the heavy lifting. I had thought it was genuine concern. Now, the sickening truth washed over me. He was building a case against me. The narrative was crystal clear. Cameron was using my physical ailments to paint a picture of mental deterioration. But my mind was sharp. Sharper than his could ever hope to be. I looked at those trembling hands, and I did not see dementia. I saw the freezing rain in the winter of 1982. I saw myself loading wooden pallets of machinery into the back of a single beat-up delivery truck when no one else would work the holiday shift. I felt the permanent nerve damage I had sustained from decades of manual labor, sacrificing my own body so Cameron would never have to know the feeling of calloused hands or an empty bank account. I had broken my own body to build a golden throne for my son, and he was using my battle scars as proof of my incompetence. Every sacrificed weekend, every missed school play because I was stranded on a highway repairing a blown tire, every drop of sweat equity I poured into Mitchell Logistics was being weaponized against me. He saw my exhaustion not as a badge of honor, but as a vulnerability to be exploited. He looked at the father who gave him everything and saw only an obstacle standing between him and a massive pile of cash. The grief of losing a son is profound, but the grief of realizing your son is a predator is entirely paralyzing. A profound, blinding anger began to rise from the depths of my stomach. It was a hot, white rage that made my vision blur. I wanted to stand up, march down to my car, drive straight to his gated estate, and kick the massive mahogany front doors off their hinges. I wanted to grab Cameron by his tailored lapels and scream in his face. I wanted to demand how he could possibly look me in the eye while sliding a knife so deeply into my back. I brought the phone back to my mouth, ready to tell Patrick to call the police, to file an injunction, to burn the whole operation to the ground right this second. But before the words could leave my mouth, my business instincts kicked in. The instincts that took me from a high school dropout to a regional logistics baron silenced my emotional outrage. I realized that calling Cameron out over the phone or causing a scene right now would be the biggest mistake of my life. If Cameron knew that I knew about the forged medical documents, he would panic. He would instantly accelerate the warehouse sale. He would wire whatever cash he already had into offshore accounts where I could never trace it. I was dealing with a corporate thief who had full access to my kingdom. If I swung wildly now, he would take the money and vanish. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing the white-hot rage down into a cold, hardened resolve. I told Patrick to do absolutely nothing. Patrick protested, arguing that we needed to file an emergency block on the property title immediately. I ordered him to stand down. I explained that an injunction would tip Cameron off. We needed concrete proof of the medical forgery, and we needed to see exactly how deep the financial rot went before we showed our hand. I hung up the phone. I stood up from the bed. My joints still ached, my hand still trembled, but my mind was completely clear. I walked back to the bathroom mirror and tightened my silk tie. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my old charcoal suit. I had to go to that anniversary dinner. I had to sit across the table from the man who was stealing my life. I had to eat their expensive food, drink their fine wine, and play the exact role they had written for me. I had to be the oblivious, declining, frail old man. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door. The drive to Cameron's estate was the longest 30 minutes of my life. The night air was crisp, but the inside of my truck felt suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel, rehearsing my lines, preparing my face to show nothing but warm, fatherly love. The war for my legacy, my dignity, and my survival had just begun, and the only way to win was to let my enemy believe he had already killed me. I pulled my 10-year-old truck up to the massive wrought iron gates of Cameron and Vanessa's estate. The engine groaned softly as I idled, waiting for the security camera to recognize me. The gates slowly swung open, revealing a sweeping circular driveway paved with imported cobblestones. Every single stone under my tires felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I parked my battered truck next to Vanessa's pristine luxury sports utility vehicle. The sheer size of their home was staggering. It featured towering white pillars, expansive bay windows, and perfectly manicured hedges that cost more to maintain in a single month than my first house cost to buy. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cab of my truck for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. I had paid the massive down payment on this mansion. I had written the 6-figure check that allowed them to secure the mortgage without blinking an eye. At the time, I told myself I was simply giving my son the head start I never had growing up. Now, looking at the glowing, opulent windows of the massive house, the bitter truth settled over me. I had not built a secure home for my family. I had funded a fortress for my enemies. I took a deep breath, plastered a gentle, unsuspecting smile on my face, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The walk up the wide stone steps felt exactly like marching toward an execution block. I pressed the illuminated doorbell, listening to the soft, melodic chime echo through the cavernous foyer inside. The heavy mahogany door swung open after a few seconds. Vanessa stood in the doorway, wearing a sleek designer dress that easily cost a month of wages for one of my warehouse drivers. She held a crystal glass of expensive white wine in her manicured hand. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. She smiled at me, but the smile never reached her cold blue eyes. It was the tight, practiced smile of a woman forced to endure the presence of an unwanted, burdensome guest. "Hello, Henry," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that instantly made my skin crawl. "You actually made it out of the house. Come inside before you let a draft into the foyer." I stepped over the threshold onto the polished, heated marble floor. Vanessa closed the heavy door behind me, immediately turning her critical attention to my appearance. Her eyes raked over my charcoal gray suit from top to bottom. I saw the familiar flicker of utter disdain cross her face. "Oh, Henry," she sighed, taking a small, delicate sip of her wine. "You wore that dreadful old thing again. I thought we talked about getting you something a little more modern, and presentable for special occasions. It looks so heavy and terribly uncomfortable. I suppose at your age, simple comfort is the only thing that matters, even if the fabric does smell a bit like a dusty closet. I kept my warm smile firmly in place, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing my anger burn. I simply told her the suit fit me just fine and was perfectly comfortable. I did not tell her it was the exact suit I wore when I built the company that paid for the heated marble floor she was currently standing on. She gave a small, dismissive wave of her hand and told me to follow her into the dining room. I followed her down the wide hallway. The walls were decorated with expensive abstract art and large framed photographs of Cameron and Vanessa looking wealthy and completely carefree on various tropical vacations. We entered the formal dining room. The space was enormous, dominated by a massive, custom-built mahogany dining table that could easily seat 20 people. The table was set for an intimate dinner, illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. But my eyes did not care about the crystal or the towering floral centerpieces. My gaze immediately locked onto the table setting itself. Arranged perfectly next to the fine bone china plates was an ornate antique silver dining set. The polished silver caught the light from the chandelier, gleaming with a heavy, undeniable elegance. Seeing that silver hit me harder and deeper than Vanessa's shallow insults ever could. I walked slowly toward the table, my eyes fixed on the intricate floral patterns etched deeply into the heavy handles of the forks and knives. I remembered the exact day I bought that silver set 10 years ago. It was supposed to be my ultimate wedding gift to them. At the time, Mitchell Logistics was going through a brutal, unforgiving financial quarter. We were barely keeping the lights on at the main depot. I had exactly one personal financial safety net left in the entire world. It was a substantial government savings bond. I had started when Cameron was just a baby, meant to be my absolute emergency medical fund if my body ever completely gave out from the punishing manual labor. I had driven to the bank on a freezing, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I sat across from this bank manager who asked me if I was absolutely sure about my decision. I signed the paperwork and cashed out that single savings bond. I took every last penny of my personal emergency fund and walked into the most exclusive antique dealer in the city. I spent hours looking for something that would last generations, something that would sit on their family table and remind them that their father loved them enough to give them the very best. When I handed that heavy silver set to Cameron and Vanessa on their wedding day, they had smiled brightly and thanked me profusely. But now, standing in their multi-million-dollar dining room, the reality was painfully obvious. They did not see the profound love or the terrifying sacrifice polished into that silver. They only saw an expensive prop to decorate their lavish lifestyle. They were preparing to use the physical manifestation of my life savings to eat a meal while actively plotting to steal the rest of my company. I reached out and gently traced my trembling finger over the cold silver handle of a heavy soup spoon. The contrast between the freezing metal and the burning betrayal in my heart was almost too much to bear. I pulled my hand back quickly and stood up straight, burying the pain deep down where they could never see it. I heard heavy footsteps approaching from the hallway behind me. Cameron was coming. The trap was fully set, and I was standing exactly where they wanted me to be. Cameron finally entered the dining room. He wore a tailored navy suit that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. He walked over and clapped his hand heavily onto my shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. "Dad," he announced loudly, as if I were standing across a crowded street instead of right next to him. "It is so good of you to venture out of the house. I know how tired you get these days." I forced a warm chuckle and patted his hand. I took my seat at the head of the massive mahogany table, settling into the plush leather chair. Vanessa sat to my right, and Cameron took the seat to my left. The psychological warfare began before the first plate was even served. A man in a crisp white chef coat emerged from the kitchen carrying 3 porcelain plates. He placed one in front of me. It was a tiny portion of seared fish sitting in a puddle of expensive truffle sauce. Vanessa immediately leaned over. "We told the chef to make sure your portion was extra soft, Henry," she said slowly, enunciating every single word as if I were a toddler. "We know how much trouble you have chewing tough meats with your dental work." "I do not have dental work, and my teeth are perfectly fine." I simply nodded and thanked her for her deep consideration. I picked up the heavy silver fork, the very fork I had bought with my sweat and blood, and took a small bite. It tasted like ashes in my mouth. As we ate, the agonizing small talk commenced. Cameron and Vanessa did not ask about my week. They did not ask how my garden was growing, or if I had read any good books lately. Instead, they launched into a relentless, synchronized boasting session about their incredibly lavish lifestyle. Vanessa eagerly dominated the conversation first. She went on a 10-minute monologue about their upcoming winter vacation to a private ski resort in the Swiss Alps. She complained about the difficulty of finding a decent private jet charter company that allowed their 2 purebred dogs to sit in the main cabin. "It is just so exhausting trying to manage these travel logistics," she sighed, taking another sip of her wine. "You simply cannot trust anyone to do their job properly these days." I sat there, chewing my perfectly soft fish, calculating the exact cost of a private jet to Switzerland. I knew exactly where that money came from. It came from the quarterly maintenance budget for my long-haul trucking fleet. I had seen the deferred maintenance reports just last month. Cameron was skipping oil changes and brake inspections on the commercial trucks, so his wife could fly her dogs across the ocean in luxury. Cameron chimed in, leaning back in his chair and swirling the expensive red wine in his crystal glass. He nodded in agreement with his wife. "It is the price we pay for leadership, Vanessa," he said smoothly. He turned to look at me, his eyes full of fake sympathy. "It is a different world now, Dad. The logistics industry is not just about moving boxes anymore. It is about high-level networking. It is about corporate image. We had to upgrade our country club membership to the premium tier just to get access to the right investors. It is a heavy burden, but someone has to carry the company into the modern age." He spoke about my company as if he had built it with his bare hands. He spoke about the stressful burden of leadership, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one who had suffered a heart attack at 50, trying to keep the payroll afloat. I watched him drink his wine, funded by the sweat of men who were currently driving through the night in freezing rain. He treated me like a fragile, outdated relic who simply did not understand the complexities of the modern business world. "Are you following all this, Dad?" Cameron asked suddenly, raising his voice again. He leaned closer, his brow furrowed in mock concern. "You look a little lost. Do you need me to explain the new corporate strategy again? I know the big numbers can be a little overwhelming for you lately." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up and flip the heavy mahogany table over. I wanted to scream that I knew about the forged medical documents. I wanted to tell him I knew he was planning to sell my warehouse. But I remembered Patrick's warning. I remembered the trap I needed to set. So I swallowed my pride. I let my shoulders slump slightly. I put on a confused, tired expression and offered him a weak smile. "No, Cameron," I said softly. "You do not need to explain it. I trust you are handling everything exactly the way you see fit. My boy is so smart." Cameron smiled, a genuine, arrogant smile of total victory. He believed he had completely won. He had no idea I was quietly watching him dig his own grave. The plates from the main course were quietly cleared away by the hired staff. The heavy silver cutlery was removed, leaving only our wine glasses on the polished mahogany wood. The atmosphere in the dining room subtly shifted. The relentless boasting about their lavish vacations and expensive country clubs slowly faded into a tense, calculated silence. I knew this was the moment. Cameron leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, theatrical sigh, rubbing the back of his neck as if he carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He reached down to the floor beside his chair and lifted a thick leather briefcase. The metallic click of the brass locks echoed sharply in the quiet room. He pulled out a plain manila folder and placed it on the table between us. He did not hand it to me immediately. He kept his hand resting lightly on the top cover, smoothing the cardboard with his thumb. "I am sorry to bring business to the dinner table, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of gentle apology. "But my accounting team has been breathing down my neck all week about the end of the quarter audits. We are facing some heavy federal compliance checks regarding the long-haul trucking fleet. You know how the regulators get when the emissions standards change. It is just a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. I need your signature on a few standard tax compliance forms to clear the fleet for the next operational quarter. It is nothing major, just the usual release documents." He slid the folder across the smooth wood. It stopped exactly an inch from my wineglass. I looked at the plain manila cover. It looked entirely innocuous. It looked like the thousands of routine files I had signed over the past 40 years. But I knew exactly what was inside. Patrick had warned me. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining my facade of the tired, oblivious old man. I reached out with my trembling hands and pulled the folder closer. I opened the cover slowly, deliberately letting my fingers fumble with the edge of the paper. My eyes hit the top of the document, and my blood ran completely cold. It was not a tax compliance form. It was not an emissions release for the trucking fleet. Printed in bold, undeniable letters at the top of the heavy bond paper were the words, "Quitclaim Deed." I did not need my reading glasses to understand the magnitude of what I was looking at. I had bought and sold enough commercial real estate in my life to recognize a death warrant when I saw one. The document was meticulously drafted. It legally surrendered all my rights, titles, and interests in the East Side commercial warehouse facility. It transferred full, uncontested ownership directly into a holding company controlled exclusively by Cameron. I forced my eyes to scan the finer print, moving my head slightly so it looked like I was struggling to read the standard legal jargon. I saw the official seal of the county clerk already stamped on the bottom corner. This meant Cameron had already filed the preliminary paperwork using the forged medical power of attorney. This physical document sitting on the dining table was the final nail in the coffin. It was the absolute, irrevocable transfer of the property. Below the legal description of the warehouse, I saw the signature line. Below the blank space for my name, Cameron had typed my title as former managing director. He was erasing my current authority before the ink was even wet. This was the trap. It was beautifully, ruthlessly constructed. By framing it as a boring, routine tax document at the end of a long, exhausting family dinner, he expected me to just blindly sign it to get it out of the way. He relied entirely on my trust in him. He relied on the fact that a father does not naturally suspect his own son of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar felony across a dinner table. Cameron reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He uncapped it smoothly and held it out toward me. "Just sign at the bottom, Dad," he said softly, his voice perfectly calm and reassuring. "Right next to the blue sticky notes. I will have my assistant file it first thing in the morning, so you do not have to worry about the logistics fleet anymore. You can just focus on relaxing and taking care of your health. We have everything under control." I looked from the gold pen to his face. His eyes were wide and innocent. He looked exactly like the little boy who used to ask me for money to buy ice cream. But the man sitting next to me was a predator. I glanced over at Vanessa. She was taking a slow sip of her wine, looking toward the window, pretending to be completely disinterested in the boring business talk. But I could see the tight line of her jaw and the rigid posture of her shoulders. She was wound as tight as a coiled spring. She knew exactly what was in that folder. She was waiting for the golden goose to finally sever its own head. I slowly reached out and took the gold fountain pen from his hand. The metal felt heavy and cold against my skin. The silence in the room became absolute. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I hovered the nib of the pen over the signature line. My mind raced through the consequences of this single moment. If I put my name on that paper, the warehouse was gone forever. The pension fund would collapse. The employees who relied on me would be ruined. But if I threw the pen down and refused to sign, the illusion would shatter instantly. Cameron would know I was onto him. The element of surprise, my only real weapon in this war, would evaporate. He would launch a full legal assault tomorrow morning using the medical power of attorney, and I would be fighting him in open court before I could secure the assets. I held the pen in my trembling hand, the nib hovering just a millimeter above the paper. The pressure was suffocating. Cameron leaned forward slightly, his eyes glued to the tip of the pen, like a starving animal watching a piece of meat. I needed a way out. I needed to destroy this specific document without destroying my cover. I needed to buy myself the weekend to set my own trap. The ink from the fountain pen threatened to drop onto the page. I felt the sweat forming on the back of my neck. The trap was sprung. The jaws were closing around me, and I had exactly 3 seconds to figure out how to pull my arm out before it was severed completely. The gold fountain pen felt like a lead weight in my hand. I held it suspended just above the thick white paper of the quitclaim deed. The silence in the dining room was absolute, pressing against my eardrums with a physical force. I could feel Cameron staring at the side of my face, his breath shallow and controlled, waiting for the exact moment I signed away my life's work. To my right, Vanessa sat completely still. I knew she was watching the tip of the pen, holding her breath, already spending the millions of dollars they were about to steal from me. My mind raced through the terrible mathematics of my situation. If the ink from this pen touched that paper, the flagship warehouse was legally gone. The financial foundation of Mitchell Logistics would crumble, and the pension fund that protected hundreds of loyal employees would be wiped out before the end of the month. But if I threw the pen down on the mahogany table and refused to sign, I would instantly trigger a massive legal war. Cameron would know his medical forgery had been discovered. He would spend the entire weekend moving the embezzled pension funds into untraceable offshore accounts. I needed a third option. I needed to destroy this physical document right here and now, but I had to do it in a way that convinced them I was nothing more than a frail, incompetent old man. I slowly lowered the tip of the pen toward the signature line. My hand was genuinely trembling from the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins, but I forced the tremor to become more pronounced. I let my knuckles shake. I allowed my breathing to become shallow and ragged, playing the part of a confused senior citizen overwhelmed by a simple task. As I moved my hand closer to the paper, I shifted my gaze a fraction of an inch to the left. Sitting exactly halfway between my elbow and the manila folder was my crystal wine glass. It was filled almost to the brim with a dark, expensive vintage of red wine. It was a heavy glass with a thick stem, but it was resting on the polished surface of the table. It was the perfect weapon. I took a deep, shaky breath, making sure Cameron heard the rattle in my chest. I muttered a quiet apology, telling him my arthritis was flaring up badly because of the cold weather. I awkwardly shifted my weight in the heavy leather chair. I brought my right hand down toward the paper, but instead of aiming for the signature line, I let my wrist collapse. I threw the entire weight of my forearm sideways. My elbow slammed violently into the side of the crystal wine glass. The impact was perfectly calculated. The heavy crystal tipped over instantly. A massive wave of dark red wine cascaded across the table. It hit the manila folder like a tidal wave. I watched in immense satisfaction as the deep crimson liquid flooded across the pristine white bond paper of the quitclaim deed. The wine soaked directly into the heavy paper fibers in a matter of seconds. It washed over the typed legal jargon, blurring the ink into an illegible mess. It pooled directly over the official county clerk seal, completely destroying the stamped emblem. But the most beautiful sight was the dark red puddle entirely submerging the blank space where my signature was supposed to go. The document was completely and utterly ruined. It was legally useless. The silence in the room shattered into a million pieces. Vanessa let out a sharp, piercing shriek. She jumped back from the table, desperately clutching her expensive designer dress to protect it from the splashing liquid. Cameron leaped out of his chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the marble floor. I did not hesitate for a single second. I immediately launched into my performance. I let out a loud gasp of horror. I dropped the gold fountain pen right into the puddle of wine. I grabbed my thick white cloth napkin and began frantically dabbing at the ruined document. "Oh dear God," I cried out, making my voice crack with pathetic panic. "I am so sorry, Cameron." My hand just slipped. I completely lost my grip. My clumsy old hands just gave out on me. I rubbed the cloth napkin aggressively across the wet paper. Instead of soaking up the wine, the rough fabric caught the weakened, soaked fibers of the paper and tore a massive hole right through the center of the deed. I ripped the document perfectly in half, right through the legal description of the warehouse property. I babbled relentlessly, apologizing over and over again, keeping my eyes wide and full of fake terror. "I am so sorry," I repeated, looking up at him with the face of a frightened child. "I will pay for the dry cleaning. I will replace the folder. I just cannot control these shakes anymore." I looked up at Cameron, expecting him to put his warm, understanding hand on my shoulder and tell me it was just an accident. But the man looking down at me was not playing the loving son anymore. The polite, concerned mask had completely shattered. His face was pale. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles pulsed beneath his skin. His eyes were completely dead, staring at the ruined paperwork with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He did not care about the spilled wine on his custom mahogany table. He did not care that I was visibly distressed. He only cared that his multi-million-dollar theft had just been physically destroyed right in front of his eyes. He reached across the table and grabbed my right wrist. He did not do it gently. His fingers dug deeply into my skin, his grip tight enough to cause a sharp bolt of pain to shoot up my arm. He yanked my hand away from the torn paper, forcing me to stop rubbing the napkin into the mess. "Stop it," he hissed. His voice was no longer loud and patronizing. It was a low, venomous whisper that sent a chill straight to my bones. "Just stop making it worse." He released my wrist and roughly pulled the two soaked halves of the quitclaim deed toward him. He stared at the ruined signature line, the dark red wine dripping from the edges onto the floor. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to strike me. I could see the violence completely taking over his features. But the corporate predator inside him regained control. He took a deep breath, smoothing his tailored suit jacket, and looked down at me with absolute contempt. The warm sun was gone forever. The ruthless enemy had finally revealed himself. "This is not a game, Dad," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "The federal regulators are not going to wait because you spilled your drink. This compliance form is mandatory." I looked down at my hands, forcing myself to tremble even more, nodding weakly. Cameron leaned over the table, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. "You are going to go home now," he commanded softly. "You are going to rest your clumsy hands. But on Monday morning, you will be at the corporate office precisely at 9 o'clock. I will have the legal team print a clean copy of this exact document. You will sit in my office and you will sign it. Do you understand me?" I looked up into his cold, dead eyes. I saw the absolute certainty in his face. He truly believed he had me completely cornered. He believed Monday morning would be his ultimate victory. I let out a shaky breath and nodded my head slowly, playing the role of the defeated, submissive father right to the bitter end. "I understand, Cameron," I whispered softly. "I will be there on Monday morning to sign whatever you need. I promise you, I will finish this." Vanessa called for the house staff to clean up the mess. The dinner was abruptly over. I was practically escorted to the front door by Cameron, who did not say another word to me. I walked down the stone steps and climbed into my battered old truck. As I drove away from the sprawling, glowing estate, the trembling in my hands completely stopped. The fear and the panic evaporated into the cool night air. Cameron wanted me in his office on Monday morning. He wanted to finalize his theft. What he did not know was that by forcing me to wait until Monday, he had just given me the entire weekend to execute my own plans. He thought he was summoning a victim to a slaughter. He had absolutely no idea he had just invited a hurricane into his house. The calculated clumsiness had worked perfectly. Now, it was time to build my war room. The sun had not even begun to rise when I pulled my truck into the massive parking lot of the Mitchell Logistics corporate headquarters. It was early Sunday morning. The industrial park was completely dead. A heavy gray fog rolled off the nearby river, blanketing the rows of parked 18-wheelers in a thick, silent mist. I parked a block away from the main entrance, pulling my truck behind a row of rusted shipping containers. I did not want the overnight security guard to see my vehicle on the perimeter cameras. I zipped my heavy canvas jacket up to my chin and stepped out into the freezing, damp air. The walk to the front doors felt entirely different today. For 40 years, I had walked up this concrete path with a sense of immense pride. I had laid the literal foundation for this building. Today, I was walking up the path like a ghost haunting my own graveyard. I reached the heavy glass doors of the main entrance. The lobby inside was dark, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the security monitors behind the reception desk. Cameron had completely renovated the lobby last year. He ripped out the original oak paneling I had installed and replaced it with cold, imported steel and frosted glass. He said it made the company look more aggressive. I reached into my deep coat pocket and pulled out my original master keycard. It was a thick, scratched piece of white plastic with my faded employee photo printed on the front. I had not used this specific card in over 3 years. When Cameron took over as acting chief executive officer, he hired a flashy new cybersecurity firm. They changed all the server passwords, installed biometric scanners on the executive floors, and issued sleek black digital key fobs to the senior staff. I had smiled and accepted my new fob like a good retired father, but Cameron, in his infinite arrogance, had made a fatal administrative error. He was so focused on building his modern fortress that he completely forgot to wipe the foundational legacy codes from the physical building server. He viewed me as a relic of the past, assuming my old plastic card was entirely useless. He was wrong. I held my breath and pressed the scratched white plastic against the black security reader mounted on the brick wall. A single red light blinked once. There was a terrifying second of absolute silence. Then, a sharp mechanical click echoed through the quiet morning air. The light turned a solid, brilliant green. The heavy glass door unlatched. I pulled it open and slipped inside the warm lobby, the door hissing softly shut behind me. I bypassed the elevators. They required the new biometric fobs to access the top floor. Instead, I walked to the rear fire stairwell. I climbed 4 flights of concrete stairs in the dark, my bad knee throbbing with every single step. I ignored the pain. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was a powerful anesthetic. I reached the 4th floor and opened the heavy fire door. The executive suite was eerily quiet. I walked down the carpeted hallway, passing the offices of the men and women my son had hired to replace my original crew. I stopped in front of the massive double oak doors of the chief executive office. My office. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. Cameron had spared absolutely no expense. He had purchased a massive Italian leather sofa, a custom marble wet bar, and an entire wall of flat-screen monitors tracking global market trends. The sheer waste of company money made my stomach turn. I walked past the distractions and sat down behind the massive glass desk. I woke up his primary computer monitor. The screen immediately flashed a bright red warning. It demanded a complex sequence of passwords, retinal scans, and two-factor authentication codes sent directly to Cameron's personal phone. The new cybersecurity firm had locked the system down tight. Anyone else would have been completely locked out. But they did not know the architect of the machine they were trying to protect. 10 years ago, long before Cameron even understood how to read a balance sheet, we suffered a massive server crash during a blizzard. It nearly bankrupted us because we could not access the routing schedules. After that night, I sat down with my original lead programmer. I had him hardwire a shadow protocol deep into the physical motherboard of the primary server. It was an absolute emergency backdoor, completely invisible to the Surface operating system. It was designed to bypass all external security measures in the event of a catastrophic system failure. I pulled the keyboard toward me. My hands were perfectly steady. I did not shake. I did not fumble. I bypassed the login screen and opened the raw command terminal. The screen turned completely black with a single blinking white cursor. I began to type. I entered the string of archaic command codes I had memorized a decade ago. It was a language the new security software did not even recognize, let alone know how to block. I hit the enter key. The screen went blank for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the black screen vanished. The secure, encrypted executive dashboard loaded perfectly in front of me. I was completely inside his system, leaving absolutely no digital footprint. Cameron thought his expensive technology could keep the old man out. He thought he was the undisputed master of the modern corporate universe. But he forgot the most basic rule of architecture. You never go to war against the man who poured the concrete beneath your feet. I clicked on the encrypted financial ledgers, the folders containing the deepest, darkest secrets of his administration. The ghost was officially in the machine, and it was time to uncover exactly how much of my kingdom he had already burned to the ground. I stared at the raw digital files cascading down the monitor. The screen glowed with lines of code that represented the absolute truth of my son's administration. Cameron had organized his secret empire with terrifying precision. The main executive server was partitioned into dozens of locked directories, each secured behind layers of modern encryption that my son believed were entirely impenetrable. I clicked through the primary financial folders first. They were filled with the standard operational budgets, the inflated marketing expenses, and the ridiculous country club membership dues I already knew about. I saw invoices for expensive corporate retreats that produced nothing but hangovers, and receipts for luxury company vehicles that never once visited a loading dock. But I was not looking for the surface-level theft. I was looking for the kill shot. I used the command terminal to run a deep directory scan, instructing the shadow protocol to bypass the visible folders and search for hidden, quarantined subdrives. The screen flickered for a long moment, the processor humming quietly beneath the heavy glass desk. A single, unmarked digital folder appeared isolated in the center of the black screen. It had no title. It had no creation date. It was a digital ghost, hidden entirely from the company accounting department and the internal auditors. I moved the mouse and double-clicked the unmarked icon. The folder opened instantly, surrendering its secrets to the architect of the system. Inside, there were only 3 files. 2 were dense spreadsheets, and the third was a massive, multi-page digital document saved in a strictly read-only format. I opened the document first. The bright white background of the legal file illuminated the dark office, casting long shadows against the walls. My eyes scanned the header, and the cold reality of my son's treachery washed over me all over again. It was the complete, finalized draft of a commercial real estate sale agreement. It was the exact document Cameron was planning to attach to the quitclaim deed he had tried to force me to sign at dinner the night before. I scrolled down past the standard legal definitions, the property boundary descriptions, and the boilerplate liability clauses. I needed to see who was sitting on the other side of this table. I needed to know who Cameron was selling my life's work to. I found the purchaser information on page 4. The buyer was listed as Cross Equities Incorporated. The name hit me like a physical punch to the gut, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. Vincent Cross was not just a commercial developer. He was a ruthless corporate vulture who had spent the last 20 years trying to drive Mitchell Logistics out of the regional market. Vincent Cross was the man who had actively tried to poach my best drivers during the brutal recession of 2008. He was the man who had bribed local zoning officials to delay the construction of our main loading bays a decade ago, almost bankrupting us in the process. We had fought him tooth and nail in the courtroom and on the asphalt to secure our territory. I had spent countless nights pacing the floors, strategizing ways to keep Cross from swallowing our contracts. And now my own flesh and blood was quietly handing him the keys to the castle. Cameron was not just selling a building. He was selling our strategic high ground to our most bitter enemy. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the specific terms of the transfer. Vincent Cross was not buying the business operations or the trucking contracts. He was only buying the physical land and the flagship warehouse structure itself. The agreement included a brutal, unforgiving eviction clause. Once the sale was finalized, Mitchell Logistics would have exactly 60 days to vacate the premises or face crippling daily penalty fees. Cameron was effectively rendering his own company homeless, handing our operational heart over to a man who would gladly bulldoze it just to watch us bleed. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady my breathing and control the furious pounding in my chest. I moved the mouse again and opened the first of the 2 encrypted spreadsheets. I needed to see the price. I needed to know exactly how much 30 years of my sweat, my missing cartilage, and my sacrificed weekends was worth to my son. The spreadsheet loaded, displaying a complex web of wire transfer protocols, banking routing numbers, and international tax loopholes. At the very bottom of the page, highlighted in a bold green font, was the final payout figure: $35 million. I stared at that number until it burned into my retinas. $35 million. It was a staggering amount of money to a normal person, but it was an absolute insult to the true value of the property. The flagship warehouse, sitting on prime industrial real estate with direct highway access, was easily worth double that amount on the open market. But Cameron was not looking for a fair market sale. He was looking for a fast, quiet liquidation. He had heavily discounted the property to ensure Vincent Cross would pay entirely in cash and keep his mouth shut until the deed was permanently transferred. He was leaving tens of millions of dollars on the table just to ensure the theft happened quickly. I traced the routing numbers attached to the payout figure. The betrayal deepened with every single line of data I read. The money was not going into the Mitchell Logistics corporate accounts. It was not being used to pay down the fleet leases, and it was certainly not being reinvested into the employee benefits programs. The entire $35 million was scheduled to be wired directly into a private, untraceable holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced the holding company name with the second spreadsheet in the folder. The sole proprietor, the single controlling director, and the exclusive beneficiary of that offshore account was Cameron. He was stealing the company's most valuable asset, selling it at a massive loss to our worst enemy, and pocketing every single penny of the profit for himself and Vanessa. He planned to take the money, abandon the evicted company, and live like royalty while the hundreds of people who built his wealth lost their jobs. I sat back in the heavy Italian leather chair and looked away from the glowing monitors. I turned my head and looked out the massive plate glass window of the executive office. From this vantage point, I could see the entire industrial yard spread out below me in the early morning fog. I could see the massive steel-framed roof of the flagship warehouse glowing faintly under the perimeter security lights. That building was not just steel and concrete to me. It was the physical embodiment of 1,000 sleepless nights. It was the roof that sheltered the livelihoods of over 200 families who depended on Mitchell Logistics to put food on their tables. It was the anchor that kept this entire operation steady during economic storms. And Cameron was selling it to buy private jets and designer clothes for a wife who despised him almost as much as she despised me. The sheer scale of his greed was entirely incomprehensible. He was willing to detonate the entire company, destroy the careers of hundreds of loyal workers, and leave his own father penniless in a facility, all for a quick cash grab. My hands were no longer trembling. They were completely still. The profound sadness that had weighed me down since Patrick called me last night was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. I had seen the weapon. I knew exactly where it was aimed. I knew exactly who held the trigger. I closed the hidden folder and meticulously wiped the access log clean from the shadow server. Cameron thought he had orchestrated the perfect corporate murder. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, but he was about to learn a very painful lesson about the foundation he was standing on. I was about to close the encrypted server and leave the office when a tiny anomaly in the primary accounting log caught my eye. It was a subtle string of automated transfers buried deep within the routine fleet maintenance expenses. I had spent 40 years reading balance sheets. I knew the financial rhythm of Mitchell Logistics better than the beat of my own heart. The numbers on the screen were simply out of sync. There was a recurring monthly withdrawal of $85,000 flagged under a vague category called External Operational Consulting. We did not use external consultants. I built this company on the absolute principle that we handled our own problems in-house. If a truck broke down, our mechanics fixed it. If a route was inefficient, our dispatchers corrected it. The warehouse sale I had just discovered was a massive, single-event theft. But this was entirely different. This was a slow, parasitic drain. I moved the cursor and double-clicked the routing history for those specific monthly withdrawals. The screen immediately populated with a dizzying maze of internal shell accounts. Cameron had set up a complex digital laundering system right under the nose of our corporate accounting team. I traced the money backward, line by line, following the digital breadcrumbs through layers of fake vendor invoices and bogus legal retainers. When the source file finally loaded on my screen, all the air vanished from the room. The money was not coming from the operational budget. It was not coming from the equipment depreciation fund or the marketing accounts. It was being systematically siphoned directly out of the employee pension trust. A cold, nauseating dread settled into the pit of my stomach. The pension fund was sacred territory. I established that trust in 1992 after one of my original drivers broke his back on an icy loading dock and had absolutely no safety net to fall back on. I swore that day that no man or woman who gave their best physical years to Mitchell Logistics would ever face their twilight hours in poverty. I had personally matched every single employee contribution out of my own pocket for over 2 decades. I dug deeper into the fund ledgers, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Cameron was not just skimming a few dollars off the top. He was completely gutting the financial future of my workforce. Over the past 18 months, he had used his executive authority to reclassify large portions of the secured pension investments as high-risk venture capital. Once reclassified, he quietly liquidated them and disguised the massive withdrawals as administrative restructuring fees. The total amount stolen was utterly staggering. He had already drained over $4.2 million from the retirement accounts of men and women who trusted us with their lives. I scrolled slowly through the names of the affected employees on the digital roster. I saw the name of my chief dispatcher, a man who had worked through 3 different rounds of chemotherapy just to keep his family afloat and his medical insurance active. I saw the name of the senior mechanic who had stayed awake for 3 days straight during the catastrophic blizzard of '98 to keep the emergency freight trucks running. I saw the name of a young driver who had just had his first baby, working overtime every single weekend to save for a down payment on a modest house. Cameron was stealing the security they had literally bled to build. I had to know exactly where the money was going. I pulled up the receiving accounts for the fake external consulting firm. The routing numbers pointed to a boutique commercial bank located in the wealthiest shopping district of the city. I bypassed their basic security firewalls using the same shadow protocol and opened the merchant account details. The registered business name staring back at me in bright white letters was Maison de Vanessa. It was my daughter-in-law failing luxury lifestyle brand. My hands gripped the thick edge of the glass desk so hard I thought the glass might shatter under the pressure. Vanessa had launched her vanity project 2 years ago. She sold overpriced imported silk robes, useless crystal healing stones, and heavily scented candles to bored country club wives. The business was an absolute failure from day one. It generated virtually zero actual retail revenue. Yet, according to the private bank statements I was currently reading, Maison de Vanessa was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every single month. I opened her itemized expense reports, and the sheer audacity of her spending made me physically sick. I saw a $30,000 invoice for exotic floral arrangements used in a single promotional photo shoot. I saw $50,000 monthly retainer fees paid to internet influencers who did absolutely nothing but post pictures of her candles on their phones. I found receipts for first-class plane tickets to Paris, justified in the ledger as inspirational sourcing trips, while my drivers slept in the cabs of their trucks to save the company money on overnight hotel fees. I saw receipts for weekly catered lunches from 5-star restaurants delivered to her pristine, empty showroom. The horrifying puzzle finally fit perfectly together. Cameron was not just stealing my flagship warehouse to fund his permanent escape. He was actively bleeding my loyal employees dry right now to finance his wife's pathetic delusion of being a wealthy, successful entrepreneur. Every time Vanessa hosted a lavish champagne brunch for her shallow socialite friends, she was literally spending the retirement money of a forklift operator who made $20 an hour. Every time she purchased a full-page advertisement in a high-fashion magazine to stroke her own ego, she was stealing the college fund of a truck driver child. The pure, unadulterated evil of their arrangement was almost impossible for my mind to comprehend. They viewed the hard-working, blue-collar people of Mitchell Logistics as nothing more than livestock waiting to be slaughtered for their own personal amusement. They sat in their multi-million-dollar estate, drinking expensive wine and complaining about the heavy burden of corporate leadership, while actively destroying the lives of the people who paid for their wine. The anger I had felt the night before, when Patrick told me about the medical forgery, was absolutely nothing compared to the apocalyptic rage that consumed me in that dark office. Stealing my company was a terrible personal betrayal. Calling me mentally incompetent to the government was a vile personal insult. But touching the employee pension fund was an unforgivable act of war against innocent people. Cameron had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He had violated the sacred covenant between a business owner and the workers who sacrificed their bodies to build the business. I sat in the silent executive suite, staring at the financial evidence of his absolute moral bankruptcy. I looked around the lavish office Cameron had built for himself, realizing every piece of Italian leather and imported marble was bought with stolen blood. My entire perspective on the upcoming battlefield shifted in a single instant. This was no longer just a defensive maneuver to protect my own wealth and reputation. This was a rescue mission. I was no longer a heartbroken father trying to save his legacy from a greedy son. I was a commander preparing to completely obliterate an enemy who was holding my people hostage. I closed the offshore banking files and meticulously backed up every single piece of evidence onto a secure, encrypted flash drive I kept hidden in my wallet. I wiped my digital footprints from the server, ensuring Cameron would never know I had been inside his perfect machine. I stood up from the glass desk, my joints no longer aching, my hands completely steady. The gloves were officially off. I was going to let him believe he had won the warehouse, but I was going to build a legal trap so devastating it would strip him of everything he ever cared about. I sat in the dim light of the executive office and slowly scrolled down the digital roster of the compromised pension fund. Every single row of data felt like a heavy stone placed directly onto my chest. These were not just anonymous employee identification numbers or faceless corporate liabilities on a balance sheet. They were the men and women who had built Mitchell Logistics brick by brick alongside me. They were my true family. I stopped scrolling when my eyes caught the name Jacob Reynolds. Jacob had started driving for me 35 years ago when we only had 3 trucks to our name. I vividly remembered a freezing night in December of 1988. Our oldest freight truck blew a radiator on the side of a lonely mountain highway during a massive snowstorm. Jacob and I stood in the knee-deep snow for 6 hours. Our hands were completely numb as we desperately tried to patch the cracked engine block, just so we would not lose the perishable cargo in the back. Jacob lost the tip of his left index finger to severe frostbite that night. He never complained once. He never asked for extra compensation. He simply wrapped his bleeding hand in thick gauze, drank a cup of bitter black coffee from a thermos, and finished the delivery route. He had literally given his physical flesh to ensure this company survived its hardest years. Now, Jacob was only 3 months away from a well-deserved retirement, hoping to spend his final years fishing with his grandchildren. And my own son was actively emptying his secure bank account to pay for internet influencers and useless crystal healing stones. I moved the mouse and highlighted another name on the screen: Peter Sullivan. Peter was our senior diesel mechanic. He was a man who permanently smelled of heavy motor oil and exhaust fumes. I remembered the devastating recession of 1994. The banks had completely frozen our credit lines. We could not afford to buy new parts to keep the delivery fleet running. Peter practically lived in the maintenance pit for 6 solid months. He cannibalized broken engines, welded rusted axles back together, and kept our trucks moving through sheer willpower and mechanical genius. There were weeks when Peter voluntarily deferred his own modest paycheck, just so I could afford to buy diesel fuel for the drivers. He had looked me right in the eye and told me he believed in what we were building. He trusted me completely. I had looked him back in the eye and promised him that Mitchell Logistics would always take care of him and his family. I was staring at a spreadsheet that proved I was breaking that sacred promise. Cameron was taking the money Peter had earned through absolute loyalty and washing it through offshore accounts to buy first-class plane tickets to Paris for Vanessa. A profound, suffocating sense of guilt washed over me. I had been so completely blind. I had spent the last 5 years slowly stepping away from the daily operations, believing I was gracefully passing the torch to the next generation. I had trusted my son to respect the foundation I had laid. Instead, he was treating the company like a personal piggy bank and treating my loyal employees like disposable garbage. I realized that my own ego had blinded me to his true nature. I wanted so desperately to believe I had raised a good, capable man that I ignored the subtle signs of his incredible greed. I had allowed him to take control, and by doing so I had placed a wolf directly inside the sheep pen. The responsibility for this massive betrayal fell squarely onto my own shoulders. I was the captain of this ship, and I had handed the steering wheel over to a pirate. The anger that had been simmering inside my chest completely transformed in that quiet room. It was no longer a personal, defensive anger. It was no longer just about protecting my own dignity or securing my own retirement assets. It was not even about the flagship warehouse anymore. My personal wealth felt entirely insignificant compared to the sheer magnitude of the suffering Cameron was about to inflict on innocent people. The conflict elevated far beyond a simple family dispute over money. This was an absolute moral war. Every single dollar stolen from the pension fund represented a broken promise. It represented a missed mortgage payment for a dedicated driver. It represented canceled medical insurance for a veteran mechanic. Cameron was not just stealing my legacy. He was actively destroying the lives of the people I had sworn to protect. I took my hand off the computer mouse and sat back in the heavy leather chair. The man who had walked into this office an hour ago was a heartbroken father trying to understand why his son hated him so much. That man was officially dead. The grief was completely gone, burned away by a cold, protective fury. I was no longer a victim waiting for the final blow. I was a commander preparing to completely obliterate an enemy who was holding my people hostage. I looked at the names on the glowing monitor one last time. I made a silent, ironclad vow to Jacob, to Peter, and to every other person on that compromised list. I promised them I would not let them fall. I promised I would force my son to return every single penny he had stolen, even if it meant destroying my own bloodline in the process. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my encrypted flash drive. I downloaded the absolute entirety of the pension fund ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the fake vendor invoices. I secured the weapon that would eventually sever my son from his stolen throne. I stood up from the glass desk. The sun was just beginning to rise outside the massive window, casting a pale gray light across the industrial yard. The shift in stakes was absolute. The silent audit was over. It was time to build a guillotine. The sun had completely set by the time I pulled my truck into the empty parking lot of an old tavern on the south side of the city. It was Sunday evening, and the heavy neon sign above the door was completely dark. The bar was always closed on Sundays. This was a private establishment owned by the older brother of Patrick Gallagher. I had called Patrick earlier in the afternoon using a prepaid cellular phone I bought with cash at a local gas station. I told him to meet me here immediately and to bring his most secure laptop. I did not trust my personal cell phone anymore. I did not trust my home internet connection or the wireless network at my own house. When you realize your only son has spent months building a digital cage around you to steal your life, absolute paranoia becomes your best survival tool. I unlocked the heavy back door of the tavern using a physical brass key Patrick had given me many years ago for emergencies. I stepped into the quiet, dimly lit room. The smell of stale beer and old polished wood hung heavily in the cool air. Patrick was already sitting in the very back booth, completely hidden from the front street windows. A single overhead light illuminated the scratched wooden table between us. He had his heavy black laptop open and running. He looked up when I approached the table. He did not wear his expensive corporate suits on the weekend. He wore a faded gray sweater, looking much more like a tired fighter between rounds than a highly paid corporate attorney. I slid into the leather booth across from him. I did not say a single word of greeting. I simply reached into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas jacket, pulled out the encrypted flash drive I had taken from the corporate office, and placed it right in the middle of the scratched wooden table. Patrick looked at the small silver drive resting on the wood, and then he looked up at my face. He could see the absolute shift in my demeanor immediately. The confused, heartbroken father he had spoken to on the phone on Friday night was completely gone. I told him to plug the drive into his computer and to completely disable his wireless internet connection. I told him he was about to look at the financial autopsy of my family. Patrick connected the drive and typed in the complex decryption sequence I read aloud to him. The screen lit up with the files I had extracted from the hidden server of my son just a few hours ago. I watched the eyes of my lawyer closely as he scanned the digital documents. I watched the color slowly drain from his face. First, he opened the real estate sale agreement with Vincent Cross. He let out a low, harsh breath when he saw the $35 million payout and the offshore holding company registered entirely in the name of Cameron. But the real emotional shift happened when he opened the secondary folders. He opened the ledgers I had pulled from the Employee Pension Trust. Patrick had personally helped me set up that trust 30 years ago. He knew exactly what that money represented to the working families of Mitchell Logistics. As he scrolled through the fake vendor invoices and the massive cash withdrawals funneling directly into the failing luxury brand of my daughter-in-law, his professional detachment completely evaporated. Patrick slammed his fist down onto the wooden table so hard the heavy laptop physically bounced off the wood. He was no longer just my lawyer. He was a man who had shared beers and stories with the exact truck drivers and mechanics my son was currently robbing. He leaned back in his booth and ran both hands roughly over his face. He looked at me with pure disgust in his eyes and told me that what Cameron was doing went far beyond simple corporate fraud. It was a massive, coordinated embezzlement scheme that carried serious federal prison time. We sat in the quiet tavern and began to build our war room. I told Patrick I did not just want to stop the sale of the warehouse. I wanted to completely sever Cameron from every single real estate asset Mitchell Logistics owned, and I wanted to do it in a way that he could never possibly undo. Patrick pulled up a blank legal document on his glowing screen and began to type rapidly. He explained the complex legal mechanics of our counterattack. Because Cameron had filed the forged medical power of attorney, he technically had the temporary legal authority to sign standard corporate contracts on my behalf. If I just walked into the office and fired him, he would tie me up in probate court for years, claiming my dementia made me paranoid and mentally unstable. While we fought a slow battle in court, he would finish draining the pension fund and disappear across the ocean. Patrick told me we had to use the absolute nuclear option. We had to move the physical assets to a place where neither the chief executive officer nor a medical power of attorney had any jurisdiction whatsoever. We needed to create an irrevocable blind trust. Patrick explained the concept slowly, so I understood the absolute gravity of the move. He told me that once the real estate assets were transferred into this specific type of trust, they legally ceased to belong to Mitchell Logistics. They also ceased to belong to Henry Mitchell. They became their own sovereign legal entity, governed strictly by the rules we wrote tonight. Cameron could wave his forged medical papers in front of any judge he wanted, but he would have absolutely no authority over property the company no longer owned. The brilliance of the strategy was in its absolute, unforgiving finality. The fingers of my lawyer flew across the keyboard as he drafted the foundational charter for the trust. We did not just include the flagship East Side warehouse. I instructed Patrick to list every single piece of commercial real estate Mitchell Logistics possessed. We transferred the deeds to the secondary storage facilities, the maintenance garages, and the massive concrete parking yards where our freight trucks slept at night. We were pulling the very ground out from under the feet of my son. Patrick paused his typing for a moment and looked at me very seriously across the table. He warned me that the word irrevocable meant exactly what it sounded like. Once I signed these legal documents, I could never change my mind. I could not dissolve the trust if I ran into personal financial trouble down the line. I was permanently surrendering my ownership of the real estate empire I had spent 40 years building with my own two hands. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to give away my kingdom. I looked at him and thought about my drivers freezing in the snow to keep this company alive. I told Patrick that a kingdom is completely worthless if the king allows his loyal people to starve to death. I told him to finish drafting the documents immediately. For the next 2 hours, we sat in the dim light of the closed tavern, meticulously closing every single legal loophole my son might try to exploit. We bound the trust with ironclad stipulations. The sole and exclusive beneficiary of all real estate revenues would be the Employee Pension Fund. We named Patrick as the permanent legal executor, ensuring no member of the Mitchell family could ever touch the principal assets again. When the final page was completely drafted, Patrick printed the massive stack of papers using a secure portable printer he kept in his leather briefcase. The heavy, warm pages piled up on the scratched wooden table. I stared at the blank signature lines. The trap was now fully constructed, loaded, and completely lethal. Patrick pulled the final page from his portable printer and placed it on top of the thick stack of legal documents resting between us. He squared the edges of the paper with his hands, moving slowly and deliberately. He did not immediately push the stack across the scratched wooden table. Instead, he folded his hands and looked at me with an expression of deep, profound concern. We had just spent hours constructing the perfect weapon to destroy the embezzlement scheme of my son. We had built an impenetrable fortress around the real estate assets of Mitchell Logistics, permanently locking them away from Cameron and Vanessa. We legally mandated that every single dollar generated from the commercial leases, the warehouse operations, and the storage facilities would flow directly into the employee pension fund until it was fully replenished and permanently secured. The financial future of my loyal crew was now absolutely safe. But the cost of that safety was incredibly high, and Patrick needed to make sure I completely understood the price I was about to pay. "Henry," Patrick said softly, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet tavern. "Before I give you my pen, I need to take off my lawyer hat and speak to you as a friend. I need you to understand exactly what you are doing to yourself." He pointed a thick finger at the stack of papers. "By signing this irrevocable trust, you are not just punishing Cameron. You are completely stripping away your own financial safety net. Those warehouses and storage yards were your retirement plan. The passive income from those commercial leases was supposed to pay for your medical care as you get older. It was supposed to guarantee that you would never have to worry about a single bill for the rest of your life. If you sign this paper tonight, all of that money vanishes from your personal accounts forever. You will be walking away from tens of millions of dollars. You will have your modest personal savings and your small residential home, but your days of absolute financial security will be permanently over. You are choosing to impoverish yourself to save the pension fund." I sat in the dim light and listened to his warning. I knew Patrick was right. The mathematics of my decision were brutal and entirely unforgiving. Without the passive income from the commercial real estate, my comfortable lifestyle would end immediately. I would have to start clipping coupons again. I would have to carefully balance my monthly grocery budget and delay any expensive home repairs. If my health took a turn for the worse, I would not have the luxury of private, top-tier medical facilities. I would be living the exact same modest, restricted life as the drivers and mechanics I employed. For a brief second, a flicker of natural human fear touched my heart. I was 71 years old. The thought of facing my final years with financial anxiety was terrifying. I had spent 4 decades breaking my back specifically, so I would never have to feel that cold fear again. But then I remembered the stolen millions sitting in the offshore account of my son. I remembered Vanessa buying $30,000 floral arrangements with the retirement money of a man who lost his finger to frostbite, keeping my trucks on the road. I looked across the table at Patrick. I told him that my entire life had been defined by the concept of comfort. I worked grueling 18-hour shifts so Cameron could grow up in a comfortable house. I built a regional empire so my family could have a comfortable future. But over the past 48 hours, I had learned a devastating truth about comfort. When comfort is bought with stolen money, it becomes a prison. When comfort requires you to close your eyes to the suffering of the people who trust you, it becomes a disease. Cameron and Vanessa were the most financially comfortable people I knew, and they were completely bankrupt on the inside. They had traded their humanity for imported marble floors and private jets. I realized in that moment that true wealth is not measured by the balance in a bank account or the square footage of a sprawling estate. True wealth is being able to look at yourself in the mirror every single morning and know that you did not compromise your soul. My integrity was worth infinitely more than my comfort. I reached across the scratched wooden table and extended my hand. "Give me the pen, Patrick," I said, my voice completely steady and void of any hesitation. Patrick looked into my eyes for a long moment. He saw that my decision was absolute. He nodded slowly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a simple black ballpoint pen. He handed it to me and slid the thick stack of legal documents across the table. I did not pause to read the fine print again. I trusted my friend completely. I flipped to the final signature page. I pressed the pen against the paper and signed my name. I signed away my wealth, my security, and my empire in 5 smooth, deliberate strokes of ink. The irrevocable blind trust was officially born. The employee pension fund was saved. The ultimate sacrifice was made. And as I placed the pen back onto the table, a profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over me completely. I had absolutely nothing left to lose, which made me the most dangerous man my son would ever face. When I watched Patrick carefully place the newly signed trust documents into a thick leather folder, I knew the defensive phase of our war was over. He zipped his briefcase shut, letting out a long sigh of relief, assuming our work in the dark tavern was finally finished. The real estate was officially safe. The pension fund was permanently secured. I could see the tension leaving the shoulders of my lawyer. He looked at me and asked if I wanted him to drive me home so I could finally get some sleep. I did not move from the scratched wooden table. I kept my hands folded in front of me and looked directly into his eyes. I told him we had successfully built a massive shield to protect the innocent people of Mitchell Logistics. But a shield does not win a war. It only prolongs the battle. I told him I was not going to spend the rest of my life playing defense against my own son. It was time to build a sword. I told Patrick to open his computer back up because we were going to pull the federal trigger. Patrick slowly opened the heavy black laptop again, the bright light from the screen illuminating the surprised expression on his face. He asked me what I was planning to do. I reminded him of the foundational corporate structure we had established 30 years ago when my health first began to fail 5 years ago. I officially stepped down as the active chief executive officer. I handed the daily operational control and the public title over to Cameron. My son was completely blinded by his own arrogance and his sudden elevation to power. He assumed that because he sat in the corner office and signed the payroll checks, he held absolute authority over the entire empire. He treated me like a ceremonial figurehead, a relic of the past who only showed up to cut ribbons at new facility openings. But Cameron had never bothered to thoroughly read the original corporate bylaws. He never realized that while I gave him the title of executive officer, I never surrendered my equity. I still personally held exactly 51% of the Class A voting shares. Cameron always joked at dinner parties that my shares were just a symbolic retirement gift to make me feel important. He was about to find out exactly how much power that symbol actually held. I instructed Patrick to log into the secure federal corporate registry using his encrypted legal credentials. I told him we were going to bypass the board of directors entirely. Because I held the absolute majority of the voting stock, I had the unilateral legal authority to compel any high-level corporate action without requiring a single vote from the executive committee. I dictated the terms of the resolution to Patrick as his fingers flew across the keyboard. I did not want a quiet internal review. I did not want a gentle warning from a private accounting firm. I wanted a complete, devastating, and entirely inescapable federal sweep. I authorized an immediate, comprehensive corporate audit by the highest federal regulatory agency responsible for investigating massive financial fraud and pension embezzlement. Patrick stopped typing for a brief second. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and deep professional respect. He warned me that inviting the federal government into our headquarters was equivalent to dropping a nuclear bomb on our own front lawn. Once the federal auditors walked through those glass doors, they would seize absolutely everything. They would lock down the executive servers. They would freeze the corporate bank accounts. They would confiscate the hard drives, the physical ledgers, and the encrypted communication devices of every single executive in the building. There would be absolutely no way to control the narrative once the investigation began. The public image of Mitchell Logistics would take a massive, brutal hit. Our competitors would circle like vultures. He asked me if I was prepared to watch the company I built get dragged through the mud on the front pages of the financial newspapers. I did not hesitate. I told Patrick that the building was already infected with a terminal disease. Cameron had introduced a rot so deep that a simple surgery would never cure it. We had to burn the infection out completely, even if it meant scorching the walls in the process. The temporary public embarrassment of a federal raid was a small price to pay to ensure my son went to federal prison instead of a tropical island. I told Patrick that the moment the federal agents seized the servers, they would find the same encrypted ghost folders I had found. They would find the $35 million real estate agreement with Vincent Cross. They would find the digital trail of stolen pension funds leading directly into the vanity business of Vanessa. The audit would not just uncover the theft, it would permanently freeze the offshore accounts before Cameron could ever access a single stolen dime. We finalized the language of the shareholder resolution. The trap was completely lethal, but the timing had to be absolutely perfect. If we launched the audit tomorrow morning, Cameron would still be in his office. He might have enough time to panic and trigger a mass deletion protocol on the servers before the agents breached the executive suite. We needed him completely distracted. We needed him feeling entirely victorious and completely unaware of the impending doom. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow night was the annual Mitchell Logistics Charity Gala, the exact event where Cameron arrogantly expected me to publicly sign the clean quitclaim deed for the warehouse. I told Patrick to formally file the majority shareholder resolution first thing Monday morning, but to officially schedule the physical execution of the federal raid for Tuesday at dawn. Patrick hit the final key on his computer. The encrypted resolution was locked into the federal filing queue, ready to deploy automatically the moment the government offices opened. The sword was officially forged and raised directly above the neck of my son. He thought his forged medical documents made him invincible. He thought my trembling hands made me weak. He had absolutely no idea that his fragile, outdated father had just legally authorized a federal strike force to completely dismantle his stolen empire. I stood up from the scratched wooden booth. The air in the dark tavern felt incredibly clear. The defensive maneuvers were over. The offensive strike was locked in. Now I just had to make a single phone call to ensure my son took the bait and walked willingly onto the final battlefield. I stepped out of the dark tavern and into the freezing night air. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the legal fortress Patrick and I had just spent hours building. I walked across the empty asphalt parking lot toward my battered truck. The wind howled off the nearby river, biting through my canvas jacket, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was completely focused on the final, delicate piece of the trap. I climbed into the cab of my truck and closed the door. The interior was pitch black and silent. I did not start the engine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal cell phone. It was time to invite the wolf to his own slaughter. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, watching the digital clock flip to midnight. I had to assume my son was still awake. Men who steal millions of dollars and betray their own blood rarely sleep soundly. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I closed my eyes and completely discarded the cold, calculating commander I had become inside that tavern. I dug deep into my soul and summoned the pathetic, trembling old man who had spilled wine across the mahogany dining table just 24 hours ago. I let my shoulders slump against the worn fabric of the driver's seat. I made my breathing deliberately shallow and slightly ragged. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. The line rang 3 times before Cameron answered. His voice was sharp and thick with irritation. "What is it, Dad?" he demanded, making absolutely no effort to hide his contempt. "It is incredibly late and I have a massive week ahead of me." I coughed weakly into the receiver, making sure he heard the fragile rattle deep in my chest. "I am so sorry to wake you, Cameron," I whispered, letting my voice waver with manufactured fear and uncertainty. I just could not sleep at all. "I have been sitting here in the dark all night but feeling terrible about ruining your beautiful dinner party. My clumsy old hands just make a mess of absolutely everything these days." I heard him let out a heavy, dramatic sigh on the other end of the line. "We already discussed this unfortunate incident," he replied coldly. "I told you to go home, go to sleep, and rest your hands. My legal team will have the fresh tax compliance documents printed and ready for you to sign in my office tomorrow morning at 9:00 sharp. Just show up on time and do not spill any coffee on them this time." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, suppressing the overwhelming urge to scream at his unbelievable arrogance. I forced my vocal cords to remain loose, keeping my voice small and entirely submissive. "I know you want me in the corporate office early tomorrow, Cameron," I said softly. "But I was thinking about the annual Mitchell Logistics Charity Gala tomorrow night. I was thinking about the massive ballroom, the bright lights, and all the important people who will be there in attendance. The city council members, the major industry leaders, and our biggest financial investors will all be watching us." Cameron interrupted me instantly, his tone impatient. "The charity gala has absolutely nothing to do with these internal compliance forms," he snapped. "Do not try to complicate a simple signature. I need this handled quietly in the morning." I let out a long, pathetic sigh, preparing to play my absolute final card. "I know it is just a routine signature to you," I pleaded, "but it means so much more to me." "You are absolutely right, Cameron. I am entirely too old to understand the complex modern logistics industry anymore. I am so tired. My body hurts constantly. It is finally time for me to completely step away and let you lead this massive company into the future. But if I am going to sign away my final operational authorities, I do not want to do it hidden away in a quiet office on a boring Monday morning, like a forgotten relic. I want to do it the right way." The cellular line went completely silent. I knew I had his undivided attention. I carefully baited the hook with the one single thing he craved infinitely more than stolen money. I baited it with his own massive, fragile ego. "I want to sign those papers on the main stage tomorrow night," I continued, my voice dripping with absolute defeat and surrender. "I want to stand in front of the entire city and publicly hand you the absolute, uncontested control of Mitchell Logistics. I want every single person in that grand ballroom to see that I trust you completely with my legacy. I want them to know that you are the undisputed master of this empire now. It will be my final symbolic act before I enter my full retirement and fade into the background. Please, Cameron, just let a tired old man have one last moment of public pride before he gives you everything." I held my breath and listened to the heavy silence stretching across the cellular connection. I could practically hear the gears turning rapidly inside his greedy mind. Cameron was a textbook narcissist. He did not just want to steal my wealth in the shadows. He desperately wanted the public validation that came with his perceived victory. He wanted the roaring applause. He wanted the elite society of the city to look at him with awe, respect, and deep envy. The intoxicating idea of his legendary father publicly bowing down to him on a brightly lit stage was an absolute narcotic. It was a golden temptation he simply could not resist. I suppose we could make a brief adjustment to the schedule, Cameron finally said. His voice had lost its cold, dismissive edge, replaced by a smooth, deeply arrogant satisfaction. It would actually be a very strong optical move for the major investors to see a unified, public transition of power. It shows incredible corporate stability to the market. Thank you, Cameron, I whispered, sounding entirely relieved and deeply grateful for his mercy. I promise I will not embarrass you in front of your friends. I will sign exactly where you tell me to sign. Make sure you wear a decent suit this time, Dad, he ordered sharply. And keep your hands steady when you are on the stage. I will see you tomorrow night. He ended the call without another word. The flat dial tone echoed loudly in the dark cab of my truck. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. The pathetic, trembling old man vanished instantly into the freezing night air. A cold, ruthless smile spread across my weathered face. The hook was not just baited. It was swallowed completely, right down to the stomach. Cameron was entirely blinded by his own towering vanity. He thought he was orchestrating a massive, glorious public coronation for himself. He had absolutely no idea he had just eagerly agreed to attend his own public execution. I finally turned the key in the ignition. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, shattering the absolute silence of the empty parking lot. I put the truck into gear and drove out into the dark, empty streets. I had exactly 20 hours left to prepare myself for the most important night of my entire life. The grand ballroom of the city hotel was bathed in the warm golden glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. It was Monday night, the evening of the annual Mitchell Logistics Charity Gala. I stood near the heavy brass doors of the entrance, watching the wealthiest people in the region float across the imported carpets. The room was absolutely packed with local politicians, wealthy socialites, and powerful industry rivals. I even saw Vincent Cross sitting at a premium table near the front. The ruthless commercial developer was drinking our expensive wine, waiting patiently for the moment Cameron handed him the keys to my kingdom. But what made my stomach physically turn were the tables situated at the very back of the massive room near the swinging kitchen doors. That was where my veteran employees were seated. I saw Jacob, the driver who had lost his finger to frostbite, wearing a rented tuxedo that did not quite fit his broad shoulders. I saw Peter, my senior diesel mechanic, looking incredibly uncomfortable surrounded by so much excessive wealth. They were the men who actually paid for this extravagant party with their stolen retirement funds, and they were shoved into the darkest corner of the room, while my daughter-in-law paraded around the dance floor in a dress that cost more than their yearly salaries. The sheer hypocrisy of the event was entirely suffocating. The large banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling proclaimed the deep philanthropic commitment of our company. Cameron had spent an absolute fortune on this gala, using company money to buy the public illusion of being a generous, community-minded leader. I walked slowly through the crowded room, leaning slightly on a wooden cane I had purchased specifically for this evening. I did not actually need the cane to walk, but it added the perfect touch of frailty to my physical performance. People parted for me with sympathetic smiles, patting my shoulder, and whispering patronizing words of encouragement. I kept my head bowed, playing the role of the defeated patriarch perfectly. I held a sleek leather portfolio tightly under my left arm. Inside that portfolio was not the clean copy of the quitclaim deed Cameron was eagerly expecting me to sign. It held the legally binding, irrevocable blind trust documents that permanently transferred the entire real estate empire to the employee pension fund. A loud musical chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the wealthy guests to take their seats. The low murmur of conversation faded quickly as the main house lights dimmed. A single bright white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the grand stage at the front of the room. Cameron walked up the carpeted steps, looking like a flawless corporate king. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his athletic frame perfectly. He smiled brightly, waving to the applauding crowd as he stepped up to the crystal podium. Vanessa sat at the front table, beaming with artificial pride, her diamond necklace sparkling aggressively in the dim light. I sat at a table near the center of the room, completely surrounded by the corporate executives my son had hired to replace my loyal crew. I placed my leather portfolio gently on the table and folded my hands over the wooden handle of my cane. Cameron tapped the microphone, leaning forward with an expression of deep, manufactured humility. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," he began, his voice echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. "We are gathered here to celebrate the incredible success of Mitchell Logistics and to give back to the wonderful community that has supported us for so many decades. But tonight is also a very personal, very emotional evening for my family." He paused, looking down at his hands as if he were trying to control a sudden surge of deep emotion. He was an incredibly talented liar. "As you all know, my father built this company from a single delivery truck," Cameron continued, his voice dropping into a tone of gentle reverence. "He sacrificed everything to build this legacy. But the years of backbreaking labor have finally taken their toll on his health. It has been incredibly difficult for me to watch the strongest man I know begin to fade. His mind and his body are simply too tired to carry the heavy burden of leadership anymore." He looked out into the crowd, his eyes scanning the room until the spotlight suddenly shifted and locked directly onto me. The bright light was completely blinding. I squinted, hunching my shoulders forward to look as small and pathetic as possible. "Tonight, my father has decided to officially step down and permanently retire," Cameron announced loudly. "He is going to completely transfer the final operational authorities and all physical properties to my administration so he can finally get the rest he so desperately needs. It is my absolute honor to carry his incredible legacy forward into the modern age. Please join me in welcoming my father, the great Henry Mitchell, to the stage for his final executive act." The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. I gripped my wooden cane and slowly stood up from my chair. The trap was fully set, the audience was watching, and it was finally time to drop the guillotine. I took my first step toward the brightly lit stage. I leaned heavily on the wooden cane, dragging my right foot just a fraction of an inch to sell the illusion of my failing body. The ballroom was completely silent, except for the soft rustle of expensive silk dresses and the clinking of crystal glasses as people turned their heads to watch me. I walked past the tables filled with the wealthy elite of the city. I felt their pity washing over me like a suffocating wave. They looked at me and saw a broken, obsolete man who was finally stepping aside to let the younger, smarter generation take the reins. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, letting my shoulders slump forward. Every single step I took toward that stage was highly calculated. I was carrying the weight of the entire company in the leather portfolio tucked tightly under my left arm. I reached the bottom of the carpeted stairs. Cameron rushed down the steps, wearing his perfectly tailored tuxedo and a mask of deep manufactured concern. He took my elbow gently, playing the role of the loving, supportive son for the massive audience. He guided me up the stairs and led me to the clear acrylic podium positioned in the exact center of the stage. The bright white spotlight was blinding, but I could still see the front row perfectly well. I saw Vanessa smiling brightly, her eyes gleaming with absolute greed as she waited for her massive payout. I saw Vincent Cross leaning forward in his chair, practically salivating at the thought of finally owning my flagship warehouse. Resting right in the middle of the podium was a crisp, clean manila folder. It was the fresh copy of the quitclaim deed Cameron had promised to print. Beside it was the same heavy gold fountain pen he had tried to force into my hand the night before at his dining table. Cameron leaned in close to my ear, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper that the microphone could not pick up. "Just sign the paper right now," he hissed. "Do not make a scene and do not embarrass me in front of these people." He stepped back and smiled warmly for the audience, gesturing gracefully toward the legal document. I stood behind the podium and looked down at the forged death warrant of my company. My right hand was trembling violently, exactly as Cameron expected. I reached out and let my fingers brush against the cold metal of the gold fountain pen. Then I completely stopped moving. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, air-conditioned air of the ballroom. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second to collect my thoughts. When I opened them, the frail, terrified old man was entirely gone. I willed my hand to stop trembling. The manufactured weakness evaporated from my muscles instantly. I lifted my wooden cane and leaned it casually against the side of the clear podium. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back until I stood at my full, commanding height. The sudden shift in my physical posture was so drastic and so immediate that a collective murmur of confusion rippled through the massive crowd. I was no longer looking down at the floor. I looked directly out into the sea of faces, my eyes locking onto the wealthy vultures who thought they were about to feast on my bones. Cameron noticed the change instantly. The fake, charming smile froze on his face. The confident swagger drained completely from his posture. He took a hesitant step toward me, reaching his hand out, as if he wanted to grab my shoulder and force me back down into absolute submission. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice suddenly thick with genuine, creeping panic. I ignored him completely. I reached out with a steady, unyielding hand and unclipped the microphone from its silver stand. I held the heavy metal device firmly. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. I did not yell. I did not shake. I did not show a single ounce of anger or fear. When I finally spoke, my voice boomed through the massive speakers, carrying a deep, terrifying authority that commanded absolute obedience from every single person in the room. I told the audience that my son was absolutely right about one thing. I told them that the landscape of the modern logistics industry was rapidly changing, and it required bold, decisive leadership to protect the absolute foundation of our empire. I turned my head slowly to look directly at Cameron. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his carefully orchestrated reality. I reached over and picked up the fresh quitclaim deed he had placed on the podium. I did not even bother to read the words on the page. I held the thick bond paper up high for the entire room to see. Then, I calmly tore the document directly in half. The sound of the ripping paper echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. Vanessa let out a sharp gasp from the front row. I dropped the torn pieces of his multi-million-dollar theft onto the floor of the stage. I reached under my arm and pulled out my own heavy leather portfolio. I unzipped the top and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Patrick and I had drafted in the dark tavern. I placed the irrevocable blind trust squarely onto the center of the podium, ready to rewrite history. I looked out over the massive sea of stunned faces. The sound of the torn quitclaim deed fluttering to the floor of the stage seemed to echo forever. I brought the microphone closer to my mouth. "My son told you all a moment ago that I came up here tonight to officially step down and permanently secure the future of Mitchell Logistics," I said. My voice was steady and completely filled the cavernous room. And for once in his life, my son was telling you the absolute truth. I am securing the future of this company. But the future of a logistics empire does not belong to the men wearing custom-tailored tuxedos who sit in corner offices and drink expensive champagne. The future belongs to the men and women who wake up before the sun rises, who freeze on the loading docks, and who drive thousands of miles through the dark so the rest of the world can comfortably sleep. I turned my body and looked directly at Cameron. He was visibly shaking now. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale white. I picked up the thick leather portfolio I had brought with me. I pulled out the heavy stack of legal papers Patrick and I had drafted the night before. I held them out to my son. Cameron reached out with trembling fingers and took the documents. I watched his eyes scan the top page. I watched him read the words, irrevocable blind trust. I watched his eyes dart to the bottom of the page where the official stamp of the county clerk proved that the transfer had been executed and legally filed at exactly 8:00 this morning. I watched the exact moment his entire stolen empire crumbled to dust in his hands. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to form a single coherent word. The $35 million he thought he had successfully stolen was permanently gone. I turned back to the audience and gripped the podium with my free hand. For the past 18 months, the current administration of this company has been systematically siphoning money out of the Employee Pension Trust, I announced loudly. A collective gasp rolled through the grand ballroom. The wealthy elites shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I pointed my finger toward the dark tables in the very back of the room by the kitchen doors. I pointed toward my veteran drivers and my mechanics. Those men and women trusted us with their lives, I continued, my voice rising with righteous fury. They trusted us with their retirement and their medical care. They were being robbed blind to fund private jets, luxury vacations, and failing vanity businesses. But that theft ends completely tonight. I raised the microphone higher. I want every single person in this room to know that as of this morning, Mitchell Logistics no longer owns a single piece of commercial real estate. I have unilaterally transferred the deeds to the flagship warehouse, the maintenance garages, and the storage yards into a sovereign legal trust. And the sole permanent beneficiary of that trust is the Employee Pension Fund. The room exploded into a chaotic chorus of shocked whispers, but over the noise of the wealthy crowd, I heard a sudden roaring cheer from the back of the room. Jacob and Peter were standing on their feet. The men and women who had been shoved into the dark corner were suddenly the wealthiest shareholders in the building. Their futures were completely restored, funded by the very real estate my son had tried to steal from them. Cameron grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my suit jacket. "Turn off the microphone, Dad," he begged, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "You are destroying the company. You are destroying our family." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply looked at him with cold, dead eyes. "You destroyed this family the moment you submitted forged medical documents to the government claiming I was mentally incompetent," I replied loudly, ensuring the microphone picked up every single word. The ballroom went dead silent again. The horrific truth of his betrayal was now completely public. I shook his hand off my arm and looked down at the front row. My eyes locked directly onto Vincent Cross. The rival developer was sitting frozen in his chair, his expensive glass of wine hovering inches from his mouth. I stared at him with absolute contempt. "Vincent Cross came to this gala tonight expecting to celebrate a secret victory," I announced to the crowd, never breaking eye contact with the man. "He came here believing he had successfully purchased the flagship warehouse of Mitchell Logistics for $35 million in an under-the-table cash deal." I watched the face of Vincent Cross turn bright purple. He realized instantly that his massive cash payout was gone. Locked in an offshore account, my son no longer had the collateral to back up. I pointed my finger directly at Cross, but my words were meant for Cameron. Unfortunately for Mr. Cross, the man who drafted that secret sale agreement did not actually own the property he was trying to sell. I looked back at my son. Selling a commercial property you do not legally own is not just a breach of corporate ethics. It is a massive, undeniable act of felony wire fraud. Cameron stumbled backward, hitting the clear acrylic podium. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit. He looked at Vanessa in the front row. She was already standing up, her face twisted in a mask of absolute horror, violently pushing her chair back as she realized she was married to a man who was about to go to federal prison. The guillotine had finally dropped. The blade was completely merciless. I had stripped my son of his wealth, his power, and his freedom in front of the entire city. And the night was not even over yet. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted violently from stunned silence to absolute chaos. The wealthy elites who had been enthusiastically clapping for my son just a few minutes ago were now frantically whispering to one another and reaching for their cell phones. Vincent Cross did not stay to watch the fallout. The ruthless commercial developer stood up from his premium table so fast that his heavy chair crashed backward onto the imported carpet. He knocked his crystal wine glass over in his haste and practically sprinted toward the side exit, desperately calling his own legal team. He knew the federal government would be aggressively investigating his offshore accounts by morning. Down in the front row, the devastating reality of the situation finally crashed down on Vanessa. The artificial, condescending smile had completely vanished from her face. She looked down at her heavy diamond necklace and the expensive designer dress she was wearing, suddenly realizing that every single luxury item she owned was about to be seized as evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme. Her vanity business, her extravagant lifestyle, and her country club status were instantly dead. She did not look up at her husband on the stage. She did not offer him a single ounce of emotional support. She grabbed her silver clutch purse from the table and immediately turned her back on him. She tried to move quickly and quietly along the edge of the room toward the rear doors, desperately hoping to slip out to her luxury vehicle and escape before the walls completely closed in around her. But Vanessa did not make it to the parking lot. Before her trembling hand could even touch the brass handle of the exit, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom were violently pushed open from the outside. The loud, heavy crash echoed over the rising panic of the crowd, freezing everyone in their tracks. A highly coordinated team of 12 men and women wearing dark, unassuming business suits marched purposefully into the room. They were flanked by half a dozen uniformed law enforcement officers wearing heavy tactical gear. I recognized the lead federal auditor immediately from my earlier career. He was a tall, uncompromising man, holding a thick stack of official warrants in his hand. Through the open doors, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside the hotel lobby reflected intensely through the glass windows, painting the elegant walls of the grand ballroom in a frantic, strobing pattern of absolute authority. Patrick Gallagher walked into the room right behind the federal agents. My loyal corporate lawyer looked over the sea of panicked elites, found me standing on the stage, and gave me a single, slow nod of his head. The federal trigger I had authorized the night before had been pulled with absolute, devastating precision. The timing was entirely perfect. The federal agents immediately fanned out, securing every single exit to the ballroom. Vanessa tried to shrink back into the shadows of the doorway, wrapping her arms around her expensive dress, but two uniformed officers stepped directly into her path. They instructed her in a firm, undeniable tone to remain exactly where she was. Up on the stage, the false corporate king was completely paralyzed. Cameron stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium. His breath came in short, ragged gasps that the microphone picked up and broadcasted across the silent room. He looked down at his own trembling hands. In his right hand, he was still clutching the irrevocable blind trust that permanently stripped him of his stolen real estate empire. Scattered directly around his expensive leather shoes were the torn, ruined pieces of the forged quitclaim deed he had tried to force me to sign. He was literally holding the physical evidence of his own felony fraud on a brightly lit stage in front of hundreds of key industry witnesses. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. There were no more clever lies he could tell to spin the narrative in his favor. The brilliant modern corporate leader was completely exposed to the entire city as nothing more than a common, pathetic thief. The lead federal agent bypassed the panicked socialites and marched straight down the center aisle toward the stage. He reached the bottom of the carpeted stairs and looked directly up at my son. The agent asked Cameron to verbally confirm his identity, and then officially informed him that the entire executive floor of the Mitchell Logistics headquarters was currently being raided. He stated clearly, loud enough for the entire front row to hear, that all corporate accounts, including the secret offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, had been permanently frozen by federal mandate. Cameron slowly turned his heavy head to look at me. The absolute arrogance that had defined his entire adult life was completely gone. He looked like a terrified, helpless child. He whispered my name, begging me to stop them, pleading with me to tell the federal agents it was all just a massive misunderstanding. I did not lean on my wooden cane. I stood tall and looked my son directly in the eye. I told him that I had spent 40 years fixing his mistakes, but I absolutely refused to fix the one mistake that was actively destroying the lives of my loyal employees. I told him the era of his stolen comfort was officially over. I turned my back on the podium, walked slowly down the stairs, and left him standing entirely alone under the blinding white spotlight to face the absolute destruction he had brought upon himself. The federal agents did not use handcuffs immediately, but their grip on the arms of my son was entirely unforgiving. They marched Cameron down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The wealthy elites who had praised his business acumen just moments earlier now completely turned their backs. They whispered in hushed, scandalized tones, stepping away from him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. The illusion of his corporate power dissolved with every single step he took toward the exit. He looked back at me one final time before the heavy brass doors closed. His eyes begged for the unconditional mercy I had always given him in the past. But I did not offer him a single nod of comfort. My duty to him as a protective father completely ended the exact moment he decided to steal the financial futures of my loyal employees. Outside the hotel, the flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated his pale, terrified face as he was placed into the back of a federal vehicle. His arrogant reign over Mitchell Logistics was officially terminated. Back inside the crowded lobby, the brutal reality of the situation was crashing down on Vanessa with terrifying speed. She had managed to push her way through the confused crowd, desperately clutching her silver designer purse. She reached the valet stand outside, aggressively demanding her luxury sports utility vehicle. But the federal freeze on their personal and corporate assets was not a slow, bureaucratic process. It was an immediate digital guillotine triggered by Patrick earlier that morning. When she handed her premium credit card to the hotel staff to pay the exorbitant valet fee, the small electronic machine flashed a bright red declined message. She scoffed loudly, calling the young valet worker incompetent, and pulled out a different card from a different elite bank. It was also instantly declined. She pulled out a third card, her hands shaking violently now. Denied. Every single financial lifeline tied to her name had been completely severed by the federal mandate. The millions of dollars she thought were safely hidden in offshore accounts were permanently locked down by the government. The stolen money she used to fund her vanity business, her expensive jewelry, and her massive estate was entirely gone. She pulled out her cellular phone and frantically dialed the numbers of her wealthy country club friends, begging for someone to come pick her up. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The high society she worshipped had already abandoned her. She stood alone in the freezing night air outside the hotel, wearing a silk designer dress she could no longer afford, realizing she had absolutely no way to even pay for a taxi ride home. The massive golden empire they had built on a foundation of lies and stolen pension funds collapsed completely overnight. There would be no more private jets to the Swiss Alps. There would be no more catered lunches or $30,000 floral arrangements. By tomorrow morning, the federal authorities would be standing at the wrought iron gates of their sprawling estate. They were coming to seize the property and aggressively inventory every single luxury item purchased with the stolen retirement money of my mechanics and drivers. Cameron and Vanessa had tried to throw me out into the cold and leave me with absolutely nothing. But in their incredible arrogance, they had ultimately constructed their own inescapable prison. The swift, realistic consequences of their monumental greed had finally arrived, and the justice was entirely absolute. I did not go to the federal holding facility to visit Cameron. I did not hire an expensive defense attorney to protect him. He was a grown man who had made a conscious decision to destroy innocent lives, and he needed to face the full, unshielded wrath of the federal justice system completely alone. Instead, I woke up at 4 a.m. on Tuesday. I bypassed the charcoal gray suit and put on my old heavy canvas work jacket. The rough fabric was heavily worn and permanently stained with faded motor oil, but it felt like the most comfortable armor in the world. I drove my battered truck through the dark, quiet streets of the city, heading straight toward the industrial district. I arrived at the main Mitchell Logistics Depot just before 5 a.m. The massive concrete yard was already completely alive with activity. The heavy rumble of diesel engines shook the frozen ground as the morning shift prepared to roll out. The thick winter fog was rolling off the nearby river, but the massive perimeter security lights cut right through the darkness, illuminating the flagship warehouse that I had successfully saved from the auction block. I walked up the metal stairs to the main loading dock. The freezing wind bit fiercely at my face, but I welcomed the harsh reality of the cold air. It was a stark reminder of the honest, brutal work that actually built this company. I walked into the small, brightly lit dispatcher office just off the main dock. Jacob and Peter were already inside. Jacob had his scarred hand wrapped around a cheap styrofoam cup of dark coffee. Peter was covered in fresh grease, having just finished a last-minute brake repair on a long-haul truck. They stopped talking immediately when I walked into the room. For a brief moment, there was a heavy, deeply respectful silence. Then Jacob walked over to the old coffee machine, poured a fresh cup of the bitter, steaming liquid, and handed it directly to me. He did not say a single word about the chaotic charity gala. He did not mention the arrest of my son or the massive federal raid. He simply looked me right in the eye and gave me a firm nod. I took the styrofoam cup and let the burning heat warm my stiff fingers. I stood there on the freezing loading dock with the veteran drivers and mechanics whose financial futures I had just permanently secured. We drank our terrible coffee in the early morning cold, surrounded by the familiar smell of diesel exhaust and damp cardboard. We discussed the complex routing schedules for the upcoming winter storms and the urgent maintenance needs for the aging fleet. It was the most beautiful, profoundly grounding conversation of my entire life. I was no longer a discarded figurehead, sitting in a quiet mansion, waiting to be erased. I was back where I belonged, standing firmly shoulder to shoulder with the hard-working people who truly mattered. I walked out of the dispatcher office and stood at the very edge of the concrete loading dock. The sun was finally beginning to rise over the industrial skyline, painting the thick morning fog in brilliant shades of pale gold and deep orange. I held my warm cup of coffee and watched the massive fleet of heavy freight trucks begin to slowly roll out of the main yard. The massive steel doors of the flagship warehouse rumbled open, revealing the absolute heartbeat of my company operating at full, unrestricted capacity. I watched the veteran drivers honk their heavy air horns in passing a loud, thunderous salute that echoed across the frozen river. As I watched them leave to supply the city, a profound sense of absolute peace completely washed over me. I had spent my entire adult life believing that blood was the only thing that truly defined a family. I had sacrificed my own physical body and compromised my own peace of mind just to build an empire for a son who only saw me as an obstacle to his own incredible greed. But the events of the past few days had completely rewritten my understanding of legacy. True family is never defined by shared genetics or a common last name. True family is defined by shared sacrifice, absolute loyalty, and the willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder in the freezing snow when the engine completely breaks down. My real family was not sitting in a federal holding cell or crying outside a luxury hotel. My real family was sitting behind the steering wheels of those massive diesel trucks driving out into the freezing dawn. They were the men and women who trusted me, and I had finally proven that I would sacrifice absolutely everything to protect them in return. The morning sun caught the side of the lead truck as it pulled out onto the main highway. The bright light reflected beautifully off the crisp, painted letters of the Mitchell Logistics logo. The name on the side of that truck was no longer a symbol of corporate greed or quiet family betrayal. It had been completely cleansed of the absolute rot that had almost destroyed it from the inside out. It was a symbol of resilience, integrity, and survival. I took one final sip of my bitter coffee, smiled at the rising sun, and turned back to get to work. I learned that true family is not defined by shared blood or a common last name. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the willingness to stand together when the world turns cold. We often blind ourselves to the greed of those we love, sacrificing our own peace to build them a comfortable life. But comfort built on the suffering of innocent people is a terrible prison. I learned that you must have the courage to draw a firm line to protect the people who truly depend on you, and to realize that it is never too late to take back your power and rewrite your own ending. If my story resonated with you and you believe that true loyalty is worth fighting for, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.